Who is the second sun? Part 1. The Mystery of the Primeval Sun. I'm Bled Scry. Please like and subscribe. To start this series, we will begin by looking at some quotes from the brilliant author David N. Talbott in his book The Saturn Myth. In The Saturn Myth, David Talbott shares his encyclopedic-like knowledge of mythology to piece together his proposal that Saturn was in fact our primeval sun during the Golden Age described in many ancient myths. A lot of the cult rituals seem to celebrate this once called Golden Age. In his book, David proposes that long ago Saturn was much closer to Earth where the North Pole is, putting off a radiant purple glow in what we now call the night sky. Saturn was stationary in the north sky, and its light grew radiant when the only sun we know today set. This proposal actually holds weight if the electric universe theory is true. David notes how the ancients used to call the time after sunset day, and how the ancient world revolved around Saturn's light after sunset. It is interesting to note that the Hebrews still keep this tradition of the day beginning at sunset and hold their holy day on Saturday, Saturn's Day. I've added highlights to the following quotes from Mr. Talbott's The Saturn Myth. Age of Kronos. Greek legends recall a remote and mysterious era of Kronos, the creator god, who, wielding his sickle, ruled from the summit of Olympus, eventually displaced by his own son, against whom he warred violently. Kronos seems to have appeared to the Greeks as a split personality, at once a radiant god, the very author of the world, and a dark demonic power. Notice how Kronos is seated in the depiction, possibly hinting that at one time he was stationary in our skies. So in this quote, Mr. Talbott shows how the Babylonian pantheon is connected to the same central light of ancient days. But the Sumero-Babylonian pantheon is filled with competing figures of the primordial creator. Enki or Ea, Nigursu, Ninurta, Tamuziak appears as a local formulation of the same great god. Each shares in the character of the singular An, ruling as universal lord, fashioning his home above and radiating light in the midst of the celestial ocean. Here, as in Egypt, the god of archaic monotheism is not a transcendent spirit or invisible power, but a central light. A Sumerian epic to Ninurta proclaims, Anu, in the midst of heaven, gave him fearful splendor. Ninurta, according to the text, is like Anu, and casts a shadow of glory over the land. All Mesopotamian figures of the primeval god possess this tangible character, and accounts of the god's radiant appearance are more of a historical than a speculative nature. Among classical writers, Herodotus, Diodorus, Plutarch, the idea prevailed that Osiris lived on our earth as a man or man-god. Egyptian sources, too, often portray him in human form. Yet the early religious texts say again and again that Osiris was the supreme light of heaven, ruling from the cosmic center. He was in fact the lord of the gods, God One. His body formed the circle of the Tuat, the celestial residence of the gods, and the secondary gods themselves constituted the limbs of Osiris. Indeed, the traditions of Osiris melt into those of Ra, the god One, who came into being in primeval time. Just as Osiris followers remembered his rule on earth, so did other Egyptians recall the terrestrial reign of the creator Ra. To this age, states Lenormant, the Egyptians continually looked back with regret and envy to declare the superiority of one thing above all other things imaginable. It was enough to affirm its like had never been since the days of Ra. In this quote, Mr. Talbott talks about how the Egyptians, like the Babylonians, duplicated the central light of the God One, and how the rest of the world shares the same figure. What is most compelling about the portrait of Atum Ra is that numerous Egyptian divinities duplicate the image. The very traits of the great god, outlined above, are endlessly repeated in the figures of Osiris, Ptah, Horns, Khepera, and Amunik. of whom appears as the solitary God in the fiery sea, the God One, who brought forth the company of gods as his own limbs, the God of reverberating speech, the unmoving God producing the celestial revolutions, the final source of waters, and the impregnating seed of the cosmos. The same figure appears repeatedly as one passes to India, Greece, China, and the Americas. For the Hindus, it was Yama; for the Greeks, Kronos; for the Chinese, Huan Ti. The Mexicans insisted that the white god, Quetzalcoatl, once ruled not only Mexico, but all mankind. In North America, the same idea attached to the primordial figure, Manabozho. Ra, the father of the gods, reigned over the terrestrial world, but wandered away when the heavens fell into disorder. All chronological tradition affirms that Ra had once ruled over Egypt, writes Budge, and it is a remarkable fact that every possessor of the throne of Egypt was proved by some means or other to have the blood of Ra flowing in his veins. But the same belief applied to Horus, the god king par excellence, as well as Atum, Khepera, Ptah, and Amun. The fact which must be explained is that the memory of the Creator King and his original Age of Abundance was far broader than any local tradition. So vivid are the recollections of the universal monarch that his story usually forms the first chapter in the chronicles of kingship, and the kingship rites meticulously preserve a memory of the god king's rule. Each stage, in the inauguration of a new king, reenacts the first king's life and death. The rites take the initiated back to the beginning, to the mythical creation. An extraordinary theme emerges. In the original age of cosmic harmony and human innocence, the gods dwelt on earth. Presiding over the epoch of peace and plenty was the universal monarch, who founded temples and cities and taught humanity the principles of agriculture, law, writing, music, and other civilized arts. This golden age, however, ended in the god king's catastrophic death. Okay, so I wanted to add this in connection to the myth of Ra wandering off. For the Roman festival Saturnalia, the statue of Saturn in the temple traditionally had woolen bonds tied around his feet, but during Saturnalia, these bonds were loosened to symbolize the god's liberation. This Roman tradition could be a remembrance of Saturn's time as our primeval fixed sun before it wandered away. Okay, this is the last quote from the Saturn myth today. Those scholars who notice the identification of the ancient sun and the planet Saturn usually speak of Saturn as a mythical night sun or second sun. But in truth, Saturn was the sun god, pure and simple, for the body we call sun today was not a subject of the early rites. The problem is to discern the original meaning of day and night. Many hymns to Shamash and Ra, the celebrated sons of Mesopotamia and Egypt, describe these gods coming forth at the beginning of the ritual day. So, in other words, in ancient days, they started at sunset, um, just like the Hebrews, the Egyptians. It's important to note that in the Hebrew language, Shamash is what they call the center light on the menorah. So let that sink in. Was Saturn the center light, our primeval sun in ancient days? Okay, now we're going to get into more possible primeval sun symbolism. Hathor's headdress. Hathor was a major goddess in ancient Egypt who was often depicted as a cow, a lioness, a cobra, or a sycamore tree. Her headdress symbolized her connection to the sun and the god Ra. and her role as a fertility goddess. In some of the depictions of Hathor, she's shown as a cow riding the boat of Ra. Notice how the curved horns are similar to the curve of the sickle. So was this an ancient depiction of the primeval sun in the night sky, Saturn? From the Mesopotamian legend, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Bull of Heaven. Gilgamesh slays the Bull of Heaven, thought to represent the Taurus constellation. But what if this ancient epic at one time represented the end of the age of Saturn? Mithras slaying the bull. Known as the Tauroctony, the Persian sun god Mithras sacrifices a white bull. The myth is linked to agricultural prosperity, and in the story, the bull became the moon after its death. What if the moon we see today was formed from a cosmic collision that ended Saturn's reign as our primeval sun? Apollo and his lyre. In the Greek pantheon, Apollo is one of the sons of Zeus. Apollo is a complex god with a clear dualism between his harmonic side and his punishing side. Apollo often appears either with his lyre, symbolizing harmony, or his bow for punishment. Apollo seems to have a split personality, much like Kronos. One of the symbols for Apollo is a swan. In the myth, it's said that he rides a swan in the winter to visit a land called Hyperborea that sits at the edge of the ocean. I thought it was interesting that he rides the swan in the winter, and I thought back to the Romans of how they celebrate Saturnalia during the winter. Notice the curve of the lyre with the swan heads closely resembles Hathor's headdress. Apollo, like Kronos and Ra, is also associated with snakes. I find it most interesting that in many depictions of his lyre, you see the serpent nearby. The planet Saturn emits sounds today that reach the Earth. You can search for audio online of the sounds of Saturn. Is Apollo's instrument a symbolic callback to the age of Kronos? What if the Bull of Heaven from the Epic of Gilgamesh, Mithras and the Tauroctony, Hathor's headdress, and Apollo and his lyre are all symbols for the age of Saturn as our second or primeval sun? Were the ancient sun gods Ra and Shamash the same radiant light in the ancient sky that we call Saturn today? I'm Bled Scry. Join me as we continue to explore this great mystery. Please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.